Okay. We finally arrive at approaching the method or technique that I've read in Descartes and George Fox. Descartes, philosopher, French, mathematician, and retrospectively one of the founding fathers of science in the West. But a lot of his things are ignored. It's quite selective. Our interpretation of what great thinkers have said in the past, like even Newton with his calculus, we ignore his ramblings, his talkings, or even his cogent discussion on metallurgy and alchemy. We say that's not science, but it's calculus is. Same with Descartes, as we'll see. So it's philosophy, and other bits we just go, well, we can ignore that. It's quite interesting that we do that. And so what we're going to do is have a look at it and just go, well, wait a minute, what if they're not wrong, if we follow what else they say? And in that way, we get much more of a sense of a subjective science, or our sense, our phenomenological experience, our existential, internal experience of these things. So I've talked a little bit about Buddhism and have a look at the Buddhism talk. I've gone through a few texts, and that kind of gets us into the ballpark of it all. Okay, our body, feelings, consciousness, mental objects. But we want a kind of simpler one, perhaps from the West itself, so that we can relate it to people who've come up with these things within the West culture and the West psychosocial environment and ecosystem. And presumably it has greater relevance to our mental structures, because in the Far East, remember, they've come up through different cultures and traditions and so on, and so the society and culture form a different ecology. And so to abstract or extract mindfulness from that is a little foolish, because there's lots of other things in that, as we explored in the Buddhist. So are there equivalent developments in the West? And I've found two, at least, in the Christian kind of and philosophical Western history. So I'm looking at Discourse on the Method, Part 4, page 15. Discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and seeking truth in the sciences, 1637, written by René Descartes, 1637, and translated by Jonathan Bennett, 2017, originally 2005. So page, 15, part 4, very interesting self-description of how he's thinking and how he arrived at his scientific understanding. And there are things in this, though, that try to say, well, he's confused about how he's not differentiating between experiment and experience, as if they're separate. But that's a retrospective distinction that we bring as scientists. Whereas, actually, what we're interested in is experimentation. And as Descartes seems to indicate, that experience is a form of experimentation. He's also got lots of, he basically explains why he did what he did. He learned things from books that he thought, I've learned enough books, I went out into the world, tried to find out what was going on there, met a lot of people in Europe, so he did a bit of social anthropology, and then he thought, he followed them all and said everybody's correct, so he learned a lot, all these different multiplicities of running cultures and running societies and having different ideas about God potentially and how life works and nature. And then all was true. And then he basically went through a radical thing and he went, right, let's just, everything is wrong. Nothing can be proven to me. Everybody's discussing all these things. I can't make heads or tails of it, or I can't take anything for granted. So, he basically came up with this. I want to devote myself solely to the search for truth. And I thought I needed to do the exact opposite, to reject, as if it was absolutely false, everything regarding which I could imagine the least doubt, so as to see whether this left me with anything entirely indubitable to believe. Thus, I chose to suppose that nothing was such as our senses led us to imagine. Have a look at the Buddhist thing. Because our senses sometimes deceive us. Thus, also, I rejected as unsound all the arguments I had previously taken as demonstrative, i.e. Absolutely rigorous proofs. Because some men make mistakes in reasoning, even in the simplest questions in geometry, and commit logical fallacies, and I judged that I was as open to this as anyone else. Lastly, I decided to pretend that everything that had ever entered my mind was no more true than the illusions of my dreams. That's a radical thought experiment. Right, so because of all, this is amazing. I'm just going to read it because, this is 1637. Yes, it's translated using modern language, but if it's anywhere close to the original, 1637. Right. Because of all the mental states we are in while awake can also occur while we sleep and dream without having any truth in them. But no sooner had I embarked on this project, it's a radical project, than I noticed that while I was trying in this way to think everything to be false, it had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something, and observed that this truth, I am thinking, therefore I exist, was so firm and sure that not even the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics could shake it. I decided that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. First principle could be 1, I exist, or 2, the connection between I am thinking and I exist. The uncertainty in the version echoes that in Descartes' French. So, cogito ergo sum. I am thinking, therefore I exist. I observe that the proposition, that statement, I observed that the proposition I am thinking, therefore I exist, has nothing about it to assure me that I'm speaking the truth when I assert it, except, so just that statement doesn't mean anything. It doesn't actually mean that I exist, the statement. But when I assert it, I am thinking. Ooh. When I assert it, but when I do assert it, I see very clearly that in order to think, it is necessary to exist. In order to even think this thought, there is something which is thinking it. Therefore I exist. Again, it's in a similar direction as the Buddhist, is the object of thought appears, i.e. thinking. That's the object of thought, and that means there is something existing that gives rise to the thinking. Okay, that's in that light bulb thing. Okay. Sorry about the reflective surfaces. Okay, there is a kind of thought object. This is a thought that arises from something, and then it dissolves, and that's our conscious state. We're aware of this. So there is something that is thinking it. That happens beforehand. So although the statement appears in that order, I am thinking, therefore I exist. Okay, that is happening post fact. That's happening with the next thought. Okay, so the first one is, I am thinking. Oh yeah, I am thinking. Okay, therefore, beep, 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 I exist. Which is another statement. Okay, so this statement, therefore this statement. But this statement is actually referring to the fact that there is this pre-conscious being that gives rise to that thinking. Okay, that's what he's saying, as far as I understand. This convinced me that I could take it as a general rule that things we can see very vividly, very clearly, are all true. Okay? But this isn't as powerfully simple as a rule as you might think, because there is some difficulty in telling which concepts are really clear. Okay, that's quite interesting. So you think, this exists, therefore that exists. If that exists, everything that comes out of the fact that I exist is true. Gets tricky. Next, I reflect, and this is next. So cogito ergo sum is quite common. It's a big, powerful thing in Western philosophy because it's basically centered on the individual. And so you get all this complicated stuff in Western philosophy about I'm thinking, what am I thinking, philosophy, and so on and so forth. And it's all based on the individual. As we know, there are other material. In order for us to move towards a social science, I think we need to do something to do with reflexive reading, and we have to have a relational basis. This is the basis of the individual. The equivalent to this is, what was it, lego or legatus, I think it was. Lego ergo sumus. I read, therefore we are. Okay, you're watching this. So the fact that you're watching this, therefore we are. Okay, and all the other readers. Have a look at reflexive reading. So next, the bit that we're interested in is to get to this bit. Okay, he does get to this bit, kind of. Or actually, when I think about it, it's like only it helps us get to this, but doesn't actually get us there. But okay, what he says is this. Now this is straight away in this methods from cogito ergo sum. It says this. Next, I reflected on the fact that I was doubting. I'm thinking. Am I thinking? Oh yeah. Okay, I am thinking. I reflected on the fact that I was doubting, and that I consequently, or doubt any other thought, and that I wasn't wholly perfect. For I saw clearly that it is a greater perfection to know than to doubt. This led me to the question, where did I get my ability to think of something more perfect than I am? And I drew the obvious conclusion that this ability had to be caused by something that was, in fact, more perfect than me. To explain why I reached that conclusion, I should first explain why I wasn't exercising about such questions right. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated, all right? I'm not going to go through it. But basically, he's aware that he's aware that the thought might not be, it's not perfect, because he does think of, okay, another one, right? I'm not perfect. It's not perfect, that one. Not perfect. Okay? And because he's thinking it's not perfect, then the thought that occurs to him is, okay, what's more perfect? And to think that there's something more perfect indicates, when he goes in that direction, God. Eventually rises at God. Because he's an imperfect being. Whatever thinks he comes up with is like, well, it's probably not going to be perfect. But the fact that I'm even aware that it's not perfect means that there is something, something which is perfect. And that's God. Okay? The perfect human, the perfect being. Perfect being. Okay, so I could have derived from myself all the remaining perfections that I knew I lacked, and thus I could myself have been infinite, eternal, unchanging, omniscient, and omnipotent. In short, I could have had all the perfections that I had been able to discover in God. The only possibility left is that the idea has been put into me by something that truly was more perfect than I was, something indeed having every perfection of which I could have any idea. That is to explain myself in one word, by God. To this I added that since I knew of some perfection that I didn't myself have, I wasn't the only being that existed, and so on. So basically, cogito ergo sum is pretty cool. It's the basis for, oh gosh, I'm thinking, fantastic, a metacognitive state. But the fact that it's not perfect, I'm not perfect, it means that there's an aspect of me that is aware of that. And because of that aspect, that leads to the notion of perfect and God. You think, wow, that's interesting. We get hung up on the cogito ergo sum, and we don't really pursue the next bit. But interestingly, Fox, in the 17th century, George Fox, who was the founder of Quakers, had a radical notion. And he was a dissident of kinds, he was a spiritual dissident. And he argued with, and he was in Britain, and he was in northern England, and he was a rough, ready northerner. And he would go into churches at a fairly young age, listen, but then argue, using the Bible, that the church and the structures, they weren't really following the word. And they were following books, and they had, churches, but they weren't actually practicing the word. And the word was, and he explained it in very natural language, but he did use the Bible, the language of that, and I don't know the Bible, so I'm not going to justify it that way, but he basically said that there is a spiritual light within us, in the same way that there's spiritual light within Christ, and he demonstrated it incredibly well, and Christ was this individual who exhibited that quality and was courageous in exhibiting that quality with others. And so remember, during this time, 17th century, we're talking about a lot of political and religious reformations of various kinds, Protestantism, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of change at that period, politically in England and also religiously. And so he was one of the many groups that were looking for different ways of exploring their spiritual existence, and generally called seekers. And so he was proposing quite a simple little mechanism, which we have a light within. And so it's not about church, and it's not about those structures, it's about light within, and therefore it's about having the courage to be present to each other, okay? And using the Christian faith and Christ as the primary teacher of this to encourage us to do this. And so he went around, he proselytized a little bit, but he didn't want to become a guru. People listened, they gathered, he went traveling, he spoke to Cromwell. He had an interesting engagement, but he wanted to avoid the whole notion of guru-esqueness, and so he developed, or he actually managed to take and absorb other techniques from other groups. I can't remember what they're called. Could have been called seekers, and they did things like sitting and listening in silence. So the idea was that it's to do with the receptive state. And so even to this day, Quakers sit together, generally in silence, and then somebody stands up and maybe voices something. And if, because of the silence, people are listening to that person in a non-judgmental way, and it's all about the receptive state. It's not about the talking, there's no sermon to it, there's no qualification of people, there's nobody higher, it's just one of us sharing something. Okay, one of the people present doing that. And I've, just like I had tendency to Buddhism, I have taken part in Quaker practices as an attender. Attended their meetings and experienced what that means. And they've got a long history of being spiritual but active in the real world, a bit like engaged Buddhism. Okay, less deep in terms of the Buddhist kind of psychology of it, the science of it, and more just the contemplative aspect and the real world engagement, and then to operate that externally. And there's no difference, okay? They don't really have holidays and so on and so forth, Christmas and so on and so forth, because every day is, everybody's practicing this light and being and so on and so forth. So, the reason why I want to draw attention to Fox is because he had this one little phrase, or one little expression, which I don't have the quote for, and I'll pull it up, maybe I'll be able to pull it up and put it up somewhere. And it was very similar to this structure. And I noticed that, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Okay, and basically, his exercise was this: to meditate and to contemplate something that was not good within us. Okay, so if you feel jealousy, I'm feeling a bit jealous there. That's not good. or you observe something in somebody else, you go, oh, that's not good. But it's better to think about it within oneself. Oh, I wasn't so kind there. Oh, I wasn't so generous there. And so on and so forth. You contemplate. And instead of berating yourself, pushing yourself down, he does a very clever thing. He says, that's like not generous. That's an example. And that would be object of thought and observation of one's own behaviour. Now, because of the fact you said it's not generous, means that there is something that is aware of this and basically is generous. There's an aspect of being that is basically aware of this thing which isn't great. That metacognitive state or evaluation or judgment is the direction of God. So you kind of back into this observation that you are not perfect. Like this. The observation that you're not perfect means that there is something that is aware of something which is, let's say, better. It doesn't have to be. So this is like not and then generous, but it's like only a little generous, and then this is more generous. And that's why you go towards, supremely generous. It's kind of like the infinite extension. The infinite extension is God. Okay? And Descartes kind of does a similar thing, I think, with his. But I haven't looked at that actually. I haven't seen that pattern in Descartes' work. Descartes being critical realist, most recent philosopher, let's just say. But he did derive from his academic study, it seems, a belief in God. So it's the light within, okay? The fact that there is a light that is aware of the thing that's not so good. This is like a little bit of kind of like dirt in one's soul, in one's being. Or the Buddhist would say it's a solid thing, it's like ice. And we go, oh, that's not so good. And that means there's some kind of light which is shining on it. And that means that if you kind of back into that light and you associate yourself more with this, you're getting closer to God. Okay? It doesn't have to be God, you don't have to refer to it as God. There's no kind of, it's just the abstraction of that, or the identification with that, or the, it's kind of a bit like the Buddhist thing, is going to the pre-conscious evaluation of that. The fact you're aware of it means, oh, that is a better state. So you elevate yourself into a better state. Okay? But the way it works is you have to evaluate within yourself. Okay? Within oneself. Now, this technique, I don't know what to call it. Okay? But it seems quite interesting that Descartes went from cogito ergo sum to God. And this George Fox talked about this technique as a means to practice within oneself, to hold these things that are not so good within oneself in order to transform them into a positive state, so that you can go out and be more generous next time. Okay? Now, just thinking, sometimes I think, why did I come up with all this? Okay, and why is that related to zero social distance? I don't think I'm going to be able to do it in this video. However, what's attempting to do is not identify yourself with the fault, okay? But it's not even identify yourself with God, it's just to get into a metacognitive state which is stable, such that if another human being is doing a similar kind of thing, then you can't do that with the other person too. So when they are exhibiting behaviour which is not so great, and they are enacting this, it means that they're dealing with that, and you can do the same thing. So you don't have to point and berate them and complain about the fact that they're not being generous, okay? Because they're doing that themselves, ideally. Now, if they're doing that, and you're doing that, and most of this stuff, okay, these ice bits within us, these like obstacles, these not so good things, that is actually us. This is us. This is us. This is like, that's us. That's what we consist of. That's our boundary of self. It's all these things that we think that we are, and usually are limiting. And it does contain us. Okay, and it makes us kind of like, human beings. Quite nice human beings, yeah, it's fine. But if we associate ourselves with the fact that we are, we like these things, we're quite good at these things, and so on and so forth, it means that we're separating ourselves from other human beings. Whereas if we treat all the things that we are as being, well, it's just kind of like an imperfect form. Not a bad thing, just not as good as it could be. And we consider that, and we get into the metacognitive state, you don't maybe not have to go towards as far as God, but we get into this kind of metacognitive state of there is some state which is better that we are capable of. That person's doing it. And this person's doing it. At some point or other, there's a kind of commonality. There's a commonality. Remember, it's not a commonality of objective thought, whatever it is. It's the fact that you're backing away from it into a more perfect state. And so backing off from whatever it is that one is, whatever you are, we're backing into something that we can recognize we have in common. It's this backing off from physical and entering into this metacognitive state and meta-state, right, of existence. And that's it, just that little thing, okay? And that, I think, zeroes the social distance. You have to do it in yourself. If you don't do it in yourself, then you won't be able to do it for another person, okay? So you have to be able to do it yourself. And it allows another person also then to engage you, and they won't do it to you. They won't go, because they're doing it within their self, which means then that the whole notion of distance between us reduces, might even get down to zero. Okay. Is that good enough? kind of. I'm not quite satisfied with it, but I think that's my explanation for now. I might follow this with just a little bit of my own personal kind of like ideas of how these work. But that is basically the technique. I don't know what to call it, so I've called it zero social distance. I think I'm going to get better at describing that if anybody's interested. But I think that is the core process that George Fox came up with. And there are millions of Quakers in the 17th, 18th century. And they went over to America and created Philadelphia, and it's had much more influence in America, it seems. Even though now in the UK there's, 15,000, 20,000 Quakers. And Descartes, wow, there's a hell of a lot of philosophers. So this is slightly different from what we've been talking about with reflexive reading, because that's quite a technical, reading or looking at this and considering relationships. But it's similar. It's not to do with relating one individual to another. Okay, this route, and it's not through language and some kind of, reflexive reading or reflexive watching. This is a psychic state. This going towards God in this manner, or just backing away, not from fear of this thing, but just go, I'm aware of that's bad. And whatever state, if you're feeling depressed or anything negative, just go, wait a minute. The fact that I'm aware, the fact this isn't good, and that's it. And that little bit of metacognition and that direction allows us to have a commonality with another human being. Okay, not quite the same as the compassion and deriving that by Buddhism, by the mutual suffering, but it kind of is. This, the fact that I keep on doing things that are not good, the fact that, for example, I'm clumsy with my language, the fact that I cannot produce arguments for my academic, my supervisors at their specification is, however, the fact that I'm aware that I'm not managing that is kind of good. Okay, so I don't I don't get attached to it, I don't get dragged into it. I kind of go, well, that's the way it is. And there's something saying, there's a metacognitive state of that experience. Okay? And that I should be able to correlate with my supervisors. And there should not be any personal attachment to that. Sadly, there is in this world, but if we do enter into this and we provide ourselves with this kind of zero social distancing technique, okay, so we're separating ourselves from ourselves and therefore entering into potential union with other human beings, or communion, or just union. Okay, okay, that's about as good enough as I can do the explanation of what I'm calling zero social distance, but these kinds of techniques from Descartes, following cogito ergo sum, and Fox's light within. Okay, making use of the light within. Okay, so I hope that's useful to you. Thank you for paying attention, and good luck with shining the light from within, cogito ergo sum, and our spiritual coexistence.